Thank you everyone for joining today wherever you are. My name is Steven Jazanowski. I'm a senior product designer at Qlik, mainly involved in all things reporting and collaboration capabilities. I joined Qlik in 2015 following the acquisition of Vezubi, which was the technology partner of Qlik that originally designed the NPrinting solution many years ago. So let's take a look at the agenda for today's session. First off, what are the reasons why you would want to migrate to the latest version of Qlik NPrinting? In the course of the migration, what does and does not get migrated via our new tool, the remaining unsupported features and potential workarounds, and then we'll close with a demo of the migration tool and some Q&A at the end. So what are some compelling reasons on why to migrate to the latest version of Qlik NPrinting? Admittedly, after a rocky start for the first 12 to 18 months of the product as NPrinting 17, since then I'm proud to say that the product has never been in better shape. We are consistently beating our own internal quality targets and have reduced our bug count to the lowest in the product's history. We took a look at the scalability of the product from one of the first releases in 2017 and compared that to one at the end of 2018, and we found that on average we have doubled our performance targets for and scale for both medium and complex type reports. We have filled the great majority of the gaps between NPrinting 16 and NPrinting 19, and we'll show that visually momentarily. The product has improved concepts around security, given the introduction of user roles, which can limit what a user can or cannot do inside of NPrinting, as well as a number of new administrative functions, and also introducing APIs that allow for a number of really interesting custom solutions to scenarios that are not achievable out of box, as well as other enterprise features. And a reminder, this product was re-architected to be multi-engine, multi-threaded to ensure that you could attain higher levels of enterprise volume of reporting with less hardware than it would be required in NPrinting 16. Here is a nice visual representation showing the parity between the two products. In the triangle on the top, starting from the left, you can see the features that were consistent with NPrinting 16 and previous versions in our initial release of NPrinting 17. The second column, since then, what gaps have we resolved? And the third column, what we would consider the last remaining significant gaps between the two versions of the product. And the bottom triangle would represent new features and new capabilities not available in NPrinting 16. And again, these would be motivators to migrate and take advantage of these capabilities in the latest release. So from Qlik's point of view, why did we build a migration tool and invest in the resources to do so? We know that for our customers, and we do have a significant customer base who still are using NPrinting 16, that when they are set to migrate their environments and their projects over to a new version of the product, in the absence of the migration tool, they'd have to do this entirely manually in a one-by-one report setting inside the NPrinting designer. This obviously is not ideal, especially for customers who have large-scale deployments with, potentially dozens, if not hundreds, of reports and tasks. So to improve the current process, and get our customers most of the way there. This is not going to be a complete lift and shift. There will still be some entities that need checking following the migration. There will be others that need recreation or new ones to be created entirely. So, but the idea here is to, take the majority of the work that's already been done to an NPrinting 16 project and insert that into the framework of NPrinting 19. This should improve the first-time experience with NPrinting 19 to be less administrative and more about setting up, best practices and being able to take advantage of the various efficiencies inside of the product. And then lastly, in order to assist our customers in the most optimal fashion, knowing that the date for the end of life of QlikView NPrinting 16 is March 31st, 2020, this is the best way to accelerate that process and provide the least amount of follow-up work for our customers once they've used the migration tool in NPrinting 19. As far as requirements go, we have good documentation on this, and I'll talk about the resources available to you towards the end of this session today. But at a high level, you'll need to start at a minimum of NPrinting 16.3 or newer. The reason being is that in this version, 16.3, we introduced functionality for project export from an NSQ. You will need this export in order to use the migration tool in NPrinting 19. You'll need to have your environment properly configured, and you can find the configurations on our help site, as well as properly sized. and that will link you to a scalability white paper that can help determine and estimate how much hardware you require for your reporting needs. And then where it gets tricky is trying to line up the versions of QlikView with the version of NPrinting 16 needed not only for the QlikView support, but for the project export functionality. So take, for example, QlikView 12.20. In this case, I need to be on version 16.7 or newer because those are the first versions of NPrinting 16 that support this version of QlikView. So two different things here. Number one, 16.3 at a minimum for the project export. And number two, looking at this compatibility matrix to determine which version of NPrinting 16 I need to support my version of QlikView. As for some recommendations, we also have this in our documentation, but let's review at least a couple of these. First of all, it goes without saying that you should review the current list of unsupported features. This is documented at the time of the release of this version of NPrinting, but with each release, we update the landing page on the help site for NPrinting to show the matrix of what features are still not supported from version 16. Obviously, this is important. If there is a feature that you use in your reports that's not supported, take a look at our documentation for potential workarounds here. You'll also want to, within your NPrinting 16 NSQ, check the reports. If for whatever reason the migration tool cannot find a template file, it'll produce an error that could result from a number of different reasons. It could be an incorrect file path for the report. It could be an environment variable that resolved to an incorrect file path as well. Or potentially it could be objects that have been removed from the QVW but are still inside of the report template. So really some due diligence around your NSQ prior to using the migration tool is highly recommended. Back up your NSQ files along with any templates and QVWs that you use in NPrinting 16. Now, if you are not starting with a brand new NPrinting 17 Plus deployment, perhaps you've tried the product out in the past and you still have a deployment existing, prior to using the migration tool, make sure that you run a backup of NPrinting 17, and the instructions for backup and restore are well documented on our help site. Also, a very critical point here. If you are a customer who is upgrading both QlikView and as well as migrating Qlik NPrinting, it is highly recommended that you perform the NPrinting migration first. The reason being is this will allow for less variability of the migration process. And if something does go wrong, it will be easier to identify it and pin it on the migration between NPrinting as opposed to trying to determine, was it an NPrinting issue or was it related to the upgrade of my QlikView? So the order that we would recommend is perform the NPrinting migration from 16 to 19 first. After that, and after checking to make sure that everything works the way it did previously, then upgrade your version of QlikView following. And lastly, consider the desired structure in NPrinting 19. We'll talk about the hierarchy here a little bit, but the problem here is that some of the reporting constructs cannot be cloned. So after you've performed a migration, you may be stuck with the structure as you've done in the migration process. And we'll show that when we get to the demo later on as well. So what happens when you use the migration tool? Well, first of all, the project export from your NPrinting 16 NSQ becomes a new NPrinting 19 app. And the concept of an app in NPrinting 19 is to act as a container, as a project more or less, that contains a number of the constructs that exist and are consistent with NPrinting 16. So those would include things like connections, which we called sources previously, your source documents for report data, any filters that are associated to fields and field values from those connections, the reports and the template files, as well as what were known in NPrinting 16 as report tasks. These will now become published tasks in NPrinting 19. And lastly, any conditions that you have as they are applied to reports will be migrated into the latest version as well. Any environment variables that you have configured in your NPrinting 16 environment are replaced by their values, as the concept of environment variables is non-existent in NPrinting 19. It's also important to point out what does not get migrated from NPrinting 16, and let's start with users. We'll go into the reasons why and the differences between how users are viewed in NPrinting 16 versus NPrinting 19 momentarily, but your existing users will not be migrated through this process. Also not migrated would be output folders. Output folders could exist as a user in NPrinting 16. Instead, in NPrinting 19, we have a new concept of destinations, so you can still use an output folder for report delivery. You'll just have to manually recreate it in your new version. The concept of schedules are slightly different. Schedules in NPrinting 16 revolved around jobs, which were an arrangement of tasks. In NPrinting 19, only tasks have schedules placed upon them, and they are called triggers, and those also will have to be manually rebuilt. There are a number of unsupported task types, things like reload task, reduce tasks, and so forth, so those tasks are not migrated. And then very important here, this migration is strictly limited to migrating from NPrinting 16 to NPrinting 19 or newer, while maintaining Qlik View as the data source for your reports. There is nothing in the scope of this tool that will convert the source of reports from a Qlik View report to a Qlik Sense report. That will have to be done outside the context of this tool. So a little more information on how users differ between the two versions of the product. In NPrinting 16, as I'm sure you all know, there was an ID field that was used as the unique identifier. You could split up your recipients by segmenting them across NSQ files. There were no user roles, so there was no differentiation between users as far as what that user could do within the product. And users in NPrinting 16 had CC and BCC as user attributes, so you could tie them to a specific user if using email delivery. And there were more import options. So, for example, you could import from a text file or from a Qlik View table. In NPrinting 19, we have now changed it, since it's a web-based program, to use email as the unique identifier. In NPrinting 19, recipients are shared across all NPrinting apps, meaning that that base of users will be available to be recipients for any particular published task, no matter which NPrinting app you're starting with. Also, since we've introduced the concept of security roles, users will need at least one. They can have multiple roles, and the roles can also be tied to a specific NPrinting app. So someone could be a developer where they have access to edit and modify the report templates in one particular app and the corresponding role to allow them to do so, while in another app they may be simply a recipient or a user of our newsstand and not have access to templates. So there's a high level of granularity that can be applied to these roles, and multiple roles potentially tied to a single user. The CC and BCC fields are now task attributes, meaning that those would be common for all of the reports that are delivered as part of a published task. And finally, even though there are less import options in the newer versions of the product, we can use APIs to do user management, and they're extremely flexible in terms of what they allow you to do, and the fact that they can all be run from within a Qlik load script means that you can associate them to other Qlik tasks, such as data reloads. There do remain some unsupported features, and while we won't go into each one of them individually here, they are all listed out in our documentation as well as potential workarounds if one is available. Now, how the migration tool will handle either unsupported features or features where there is a new attribute or a new workflow depends on the feature itself. So there could be several different possible outcomes. An example could be that the migration tool assigns a default value. So we have a new parameter in NPrinting 19 around report quality. So since there was no corresponding value in the NPrinting 16 NSQ, we'll put a default value in there. We can also create a quote-unquote empty entity. So for example, bookmark filters are something not supported in NPrinting 19. That does not mean that we won't create the filter. We will create the filter, notify the admin or the user running the import that there was a problem with the filter due to an unsupported type. But then that also allows the preservation of the filter to be applied to any existing reports. That allows me as a developer to update the filter to something that will work with NPrinting 19 and ensure that any filters that I had applied using this previously are intact seamlessly. Or lastly, we could do something like remove the feature. So in NPrinting 16, using an HTML file for the email body is no longer supported. We will simply strip out the HTML file and allow the user a blank email canvas. Now, the logs will show the user any errors or warnings, and they'll allow the user an icon that can open up that specific construct in a new window so they can troubleshoot it, make any adjustments to it, or potentially delete it from their deployment entirely if they decide it's no longer needed. So there is good documentation for you to refer to for additional details that I don't have the time to get into in this session, but especially for the listing of unsupported features and potential workarounds. There are also some best practices and some links to tutorials on what you can do with the reporting APIs, and those are all found in the Migration Tool FAQ, and we'll provide you with these links following the session. There's also a brief video, a YouTube tutorial showing how the migration tool works. Now, I'll do my own demo that will result in some more errors to show you what the resolution path would be like for some of them. And of course, on our help site, we have a new section dedicated entirely to this migration process, an explicit listing of all requirements, etc. So please consult these 3 resources prior to and during the course of your migration. So with all that in mind, let's finally take a look at the migration tool in action. Okay, so here we are in the NPrinting 16 Designer. I have opened up an NSQ and I want to be able to export this project to use with the migration tool in NPrinting 19. So again, at a minimum, this has to be Qlik View NPrinting version 16.3. This is where the export project functionality first appears. And I'll click that button and this will produce a zip file. And I'll just put it on my desktop. Okay, so this will take a moment and it will include all of the relevant constructs that we need to perform a migration into NPrinting 19. And once the zip file is created, I'll just copy it and I'll paste it onto my new NPrinting 19 machine. Okay, now we're on our NPrinting 19 machine, and I'm going to paste in the zip file from the project export, and we'll need that momentarily. So if I go to the NPrinting 19 web console, you'll notice that in the admin section of the ribbon, there is an item for importing NPrinting 16 projects. Prior to that, you should ensure that the user that will be performing this action has the appropriate permission to do so. We've established a specific permission around importing NPrinting 16 projects, and if I enable that for a given security role, it opens up the access for that user to be able to go back and modify, check, edit, or delete things like apps, connections, filters, and so forth, all of the contents of the project export that will be imported. Now, this does not open up any permissions around users or admin, so you don't have to worry about any security issues there, but do know that the checking off of the importing and NPrinting 16 projects will imply all of these permissions for these content types to be opened as well. Okay, so I am the admin in this environment, so I have this permission by default. So I will go to Import NPrinting 16 Projects, and I'll click on Import Project, and I'll browse for the zip file that I just pasted. Okay, and the first thing it's going to do is check the file paths of any connections. These could be local connections or these could be server connections. I would say it's probably unlikely that the server will have changed from NPrinting 16 to NPrinting 19, the Qlik View server that is. But if it's being resolved with an environment variable in your old NSQ, you may want to check to make sure that that value is still appropriate. Now in this case, I have 2 connections that are both local QVWs, and I'm changing the file structure on this, my new NPrinting 19 machine. So I want to keep them in this directory, and I'll make that update right now. Now the file paths will be checked prior to the actual migration tool being run in its entirety. The first thing it will do is make sure that it can access these QVWs and generate the connection cache for both of these. This will ensure that any references to objects inside of templates, any fields or field values that are used for filters and so forth will be able to be accessed by the migration tool. If there is an error here, it could be due to an incorrect file path, and you can go back and correct that. But none of the migration tool's additional steps will run until the connection cache has been generated for any QVW that you have coming from your project import. As I am waiting for the metadata to generate, I can also see the status of these if I go up into the ribbon under the admin section again and click on task executions. I'll open that in a separate tab just for convenience purposes, but I could do this inside this tab and not have any impact on the actual migration tool. It will not abort by leaving this page. So we'll look at this in a new tab here, and it should show that it is trying to access both of the QVWs. And that we have this job running, and the progress will be updated along with a status change when the process is completed. All right, so both connections have had their metadata generated, so we can go back to the log here, and you'll see kind of the details of how things unfold. The environment variables from the NSQ are evaluated and then used wherever they are pointed to or referenced. The connection cache has to be generated in order for the subsequent steps to take place. And the first thing after that is the importing of filters. So in this case, we see a couple of errors in red here. The first one is an example that used a bookmark filter in NPrinting 16. Bookmark filters are not supported in NPrinting 17 and beyond. So the filter itself will be created, but it won't have any logic behind it. So we'll take a look at how we can remedy that momentarily. Beneath that, we see another one that utilized bookmark filters, and then further down, we also see that there is a linked fields filter for year all values, another filter type that is not supported, but the remainder of them, including variable filters, select excluded filters, and advanced search filters, are all possible in NPrinting 19, and we suggest trying to use one or a combination of those to try and replicate unsupported filter types in the product today. Now, if I keep scrolling down, you'll see that it's brought in a number of other filters. I do get a few different warnings because some of the parameters on filters in NPrinting 16, things like lock, are not available in NPrinting 19. So just a warning that things might behave differently, and you'd want to verify the results of your reports to ensure that it acts the same as it had been previously. There are some other, error handling controls that we have in the product that are new that can help assist with that to maintain consistency. Following the filters, the reports will then be imported. And we see here that, for example, an Excel report that uses a filter that was not imported due to it being a bookmark filter needs to be verified. Now, the nice thing about this is that we can open that report directly from the migration tool logs, and it shows me the error, the specific error around the filter that needs to be verified. So in this case, I can actually go directly to that filter from this particular warning. And I can essentially recreate what I had as a bookmark filter in NPrinting 16 with a new filter in NPrinting 19. So this will be from the sales demo connection where the bookmark filter originated from. I will use the, here we go, order date. And this will be an advanced search filter because it can return an array of values, and I basically want the last year's worth of days available for the order date. So I'll click on create. I can go back to the overview here, and now that I've resolved this, I can delete the message. I'll close out of this particular tab, and I now have the same filter that I had previously applied as a bookmark filter, now applied as an advanced search filter to this particular report, so I can resolve this warning message as well. I'll go back to the logs here, and as we continue to scroll down, we see a lot of other reports coming in, a couple warnings as well, until we get down here and we do see some red. And in this case, the reason that these reports were not imported is that the files were not found. It could be that perhaps this was an old report that's no longer active in your NPrinting 16 environment and it's been deleted, or an environment variable resolves to a file path that is now invalid. That's why we recommend checking your NSQs ahead of time to ensure that the reports that you want to be migrated are all available to do so. Now, this is not cause for concern such that you need to completely restart your migration. If you did want this report or these reports included as part of your new NPrinting 19 app, you can import them on an individual basis through the NPrinting designer, so you don't have to completely start over. In other words, you don't need to update it in the old NSQ and then reinitiate the migration tool process. Rather, do it after the fact through the designer in a more manual fashion. And we can continue going down the list and following the reports. These are the published tasks, formerly known as report tasks in NPrinting 16, renamed published task in NPrinting 19. Here you are likely to see a number of warnings. As a reminder, using an output folder in NPrinting 16, we've kind of changed the concept. That folder used to be more or less a user in the older versions of NPrinting. Now folders are set as destinations in NPrinting 19. So it's not that you cannot deliver to one of these folders, but you will have to manually set them up and also include them as destinations in a published task, and we'll look at that momentarily. That's largely what you'll see for the warnings that come through in here. You will perhaps also see other ones where something like an email attachment was included, or an email tag that is no longer valid as part of the variables or tags available in NPrinting 19. But you will see some actual errors if the output format is no longer supported. So one of the formats that we used to support was to send to printer. That is not supported, so that's why you'll see it in red as an error here. And I believe a little bit further down the line, there should be one right here about Qlik entity reports using the output format PNG. We do have other image formats available as outputs, but PNG is not one of them in NPrinting 17 and beyond. If I want to be able to check anything that's been in here, of course, I can always open up the task directly from the migration tool logs. And just to walk through here what this looks like inside, we have some reports, and one of the parameters, for example, that's new to NPrinting 19 is setting the image quality for reports. By default, we leave this at normal, which is 92 dpi, but then there is also high at 186 and very high at 382. So I'll set that to very high. I want it to look the best, and I can click on Save. Once again, as I walk through this published task, since users are not imported as part of this migration tool, once you find the proper mechanism for importing them into NPrinting 19, whether that's via Excel, whether that's via LDAP or the APIs, then you would have to go to this published task and add these users to there. Filters would be applied at the report level. Being able to filter at the task level here would be something you would have to reconfigure. And then the destinations all would have to be modified or initially set here to include new things like the NPrinting newsstand, which is an online subscription hub, whether they're being sent via email or to the Qlik Sense hub. In addition, you could include any destinations, any folder destinations that you would have set up in an admin manual fashion. As far as the email message, if there is an email message that was used for the report task in NPrinting 16, it will be brought over here, including any kinds of variables or tags that you included, provided they are still supported in this version. The email tag supports that have been deprecated is listed online in the help site as well as in the FAQ, so please check there, but it would also come through in the migration tool logs as we saw a little bit earlier. And then lastly, the triggers. These are schedules. As a reminder, schedules in NPrinting 16 referred to how you executed jobs, and jobs consisted of a series of tasks in a sequential order. We do not have this idea of jobs in NPrinting 19. So schedules, or triggers in this case, are attached on a task-by-task basis, and then any conditions you wanted to add to the report task as well could be done here. A final error could possibly arrive if earlier in the migration tool process a report was not found. So this was one of the ones that we did receive an error for, that the actual template file could not be located. You'll also get an error if there's a dependency and any published task is distributing that report. So we'll see it 2 times in the log, once for the template file and also when that template file is used in a published task. And finally, at the bottom, we have a handful of warnings here. These relate to possible issues when an object or a field or a level using a dimension that is inside one of your NPrinting 16 reports, if maybe that element no longer exists in the source QVW, or if it's been changed or renamed, that can necessitate a warning here. So for example, let's take a look at this simple multi-doc Excel report, and I'll open that in a new tab. I've got a warning here that we just saw on the previous screen. So let's edit the template and see exactly what entity is in question here. And that will happen when the designer opens up, and it's a column in a table from chart 221 that there's a column not found. Okay, so I'll leave that in there for now. I'll click on the table. I'll right-click and do an update here, and I've now imported the new column, taken out the old column, and that should resolve the error here or the warning. So I'll save and close out of this, and I can now also delete this warning message pertaining to this report, and I would continue my checks on these reports to see, is there an object missing, or do I have to make a simple update like I did previously. And at the bottom here, it gives me a summary of what's been imported, the number of connections, filters, conditions, reports, and published tasks, and how many warnings and errors those resulted in. But it should be fairly straightforward to perform these checks. The log files are very intuitive here, and we have some very good online documentation specific to troubleshooting these logs and these steps on our help site. So I urge you to consult that along with the FAQ document from community as you're going through this process. And finally, in addition to the summary statistics here in the log file, if I want to see what actually happened, I can go to my apps from up top. And this is the one that we just wound up importing. Let's do it by the created date. Okay, so I'm going to rename this something easier to identify. And click on Save. And then I can go through, any of the additional screens here. So if I wanted to, filter on the reports that came out of a result of this migration tool demo, I can do that. I can also do that on the published task page. So that gives me a way of easily identifying what content I migrated and now which NPrinting 19 app that content is associated with.
Okay, everyone, now it's time for Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A panel on the left side of your ON24 console. Stephen, which question would you like to address first?
All right, it looks like we have a number of good questions, Troy, so let's just start with the list and see how many we can get in here. The first question is the process similar to a migration from NPrinting 17 to 19? We would say that NPrinting 17 to 19 is an upgrade. It's the same product, just improved with new features and improvements and bug fixes. So that is a more traditional upgrade. The migration is going from 16 to 19, which is a completely new product. So the process would not be similar. 17 to 18 to 19, all of those versions of 17 plus are your traditional upgrades, but this specifically going from 16 to the latest version is the migration with the tool. Next question is, will it be possible to have LDAP authentication in NPrinting? This is something that we started supporting last year as one of the methods for recipient import. So yes, LDAP authentication is already supported as well as API-based user management as well. Next question is, do all the functions from 18 work in 19? The answer to that question is yes, and then some, since the product has definitely improved since then. If you think about the two different versions of NPrinting, again, you kind of have 16 and earlier, and then 17 and later is the cutoff point. So 17, 18, 19, they're all the same product, just the new numbering and naming is based on the year it was released. So, 19 is for a release in 2019. When we release our next version in February of 2020, it will be Qlik NPrinting 20. Next question, when will NPrinting support end? We touched on this earlier in the session. It's March 31st, 2020, also documented online. We have a question here on what is the alternative for recipient load in NPrinting 19. We do have less possibilities for recipient import and management than we did in the version 16, but we do have API-based user management connecting to LDAP and also an Excel file that you can use as a template that's downloadable off of our help site to ensure that the fields and syntax all line up with what's needed for NPrinting to process users. The next question is that NPrinting 16 had the ability to reload Qlik view documents. Will this feature be included in future versions? I also touched on this earlier, so we are not supporting this as a task type along with other task types that were available in NPrinting 16. However, because of the fact that we now have reporting APIs, you can do a lot of this inside of a Qlik load script and create dependencies with native Qlik syntax and our APIs. So inside of a script, you could link, a publish task or a metadata reload to the successful completion of a reload of a QVW. So we don't have a task type to directly support that in NPrinting, but with the introduction of APIs, it still can be done in a Qlik load script and is extremely flexible and dynamic. Next is, just like in NPrinting 16, is there an option to test the report in NPrinting 17 plus? Earlier, one of the slides that I showed around feature parity, you'll notice that there were two remaining what we would consider significant gaps. One of them is around the dynamic CCC and BCCs in emails, but the other one would be report test task. So this is something that we are working on, is on our roadmap, but without an ETA at the moment. Next, does the option of recipient groups, is that available in NPrinting 17? Yes, it can be individual users. It can also be groups of recipients. They can be imported and assigned to different groups. And we actually are working on something right now to make recipient groups even more dynamic and flexible, and we hope to have some exciting information about that in the first half of this year. Next, is it possible to use the migration tool when migrating to both NPrinting 19 and from QlikView to QlikSense? I'm glad this was asked. I know it was part of the call today, but I do want to reiterate this because it's an extremely important point. The migration tool is a utility whose scope is limited to going from NPrinting 16 to NPrinting 19 with your reports maintaining QlikView as the data source. There is nothing to automate the changeover from the data being QlikView-based to QlikSense-based. That is something that would have to be done manually. You can always open an existing template that used a QlikView data source and re-drag references to the same data in QlikSense, but that would be a manual process outside of this tool. Next is, do we have to perform a clean installation again to upgrade NPrinting September 2019 to the latest version with this migration utility? So I wouldn't say it's a clean installation. It's a strictly an upgrade from whatever version of NPrinting 17 plus you may have been on. And this is going, again, if you want to take advantage of the migration utility, the earliest version of that is going to be November 2019. It will be present in our future versions, obviously, so February 2020 will also have that. But if you do have an existing NPrinting 17 plus deployment, you'll need to obviously migrate to at least November 2019 to be able to take advantage of the migration tool. Next, can we get detailed level logs in version NPrinting 19? The answer to that is yes. We actually have that on our help site. So give me 1 second here and I'll try to share that with everybody. Okay, we have it in the administering section. And if we go to logging, I'll just open this up in a new tab. And there is a section here around changing the log details level. By default, this will be at info level when you install the product, but you can change it to debug, which gives you a lot more visibility into what's going on with the logs and behind the scenes. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a couple more things that I referenced throughout the session today. Number one, we have a new section in our help site specifically around migrating. So you can see here that we have a demo video, kind of a good recommendations and best practices on planning. But I know I talked about this specifically about troubleshooting the migration. This page goes into great detail, listing all of the possible warnings, possible errors, and what you can do about that. So this is a really good page to have open as you're going through the migration tool process. And also a very, very valuable resource will be the migration tool FAQ. We will give you the link to this. It's available on Qlik Community, so you can always search for the title of this document. In addition to a description, I've got some other links inside here, but most importantly, the actual FAQ document itself, which goes into great detail around requirements, best practices, and potential workarounds. And specifically, we do have a section around what are the possibilities with the new APIs, because they really offer a lot of innovative approaches to things that maybe you could have done previously but can't do now, or a completely new scenario that isn't available out of the box. So I think that's all the time for questions that we will have today. So I hope you found this session informative and enlightening, and will help you and assist you as you go on your migration journey from QlikView NPrinting 16 to Qlik NPrinting 19. And I look forward to hearing your success stories.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you to Stephen for presenting. We appreciate getting experts like Stephen to share with us. Here's our legal disclaimer. And thank you once again. Have a great rest of your day.